So let's move on. We will see that we have sometimes what we call exponential growth. So in this case, the population increase very rapidly. So we have idealized conditions that allow the population to increase dramatically. And in this case, we will refer to R as R max, or intrinsic rate of increase. Remember, R was the rate of increase, but now when the population is growing in exponential type of growth, the R will be max, because now the population is growing at the maximum rate. So how the exponential growth is going to be presented in figures, this will result in a J-shaped curve. So as you can see in this image, we have two curves. Both of them, they are giving us the shape of a J letter. One thing is that the R max is positive. It is more than 0, because we can see an increase in the population size. And number two, the bigger the R max, the steeper the curve will be. So here 1, here 0.5. So because of that, the red curve is more steeper than the blue one, because the R max is larger or bigger value. So two examples we are going to show for the exponential growth. The first one comes from the African elephants in Kruger National Park, South Africa. So what happened there? So they came up with treaty to stop the extinction of elephants. So they stopped hunting elephants. So in this park there were a few number of elephants, and because of that there is no competition between them. So the environment allowed the exponential growth of elephants, so they reproduce exponentially, as you can see in the figure. And the second example, we can see it in the lab when we grow bacteria into a new environment. So they start by a line like that, and then this line takes off, giving us the J-shaped, which is characteristic for the exponential growth. Why we say a new environment? Because a new environment means a new media which is full of nutrients, so there are no limitations, or at least no strong limitations that may limit the growth of this bacteria at the beginning. Later on, things may happen which may limit their growth, as we will see later on. So as I have mentioned in the previous slide, thinking that the exponential growth will continue forever, this is not realistic, because actually there are some limitations for the exponential growth. It will not continue forever. Why? Because there is intra-specific competition. So there is a competition between individuals of the same species in that population, and because of that, the population has a maximum carrying capacity. So we call this the carrying capacity, which is the maximum population size the environment can support. So going back to the example of bacterial growth, the test tube or the petri dish in which you grow the bacteria has a carrying capacity, and once the test tube becomes very turbid, now many bacteria are there, the carrying capacity of the medium is nearly reached, the intraspecific competition between the bacterial cells will be higher, then the exponential growth will fade. Because of that, we have the logistic growth model. So in the logistic growth model, it takes into consideration the factor of the carrying capacity, and we find that the R max will decrease once the population size, which is n, reaches the carrying capacity. So as you can see, this is more or less the equation that we have shown before. So it was actually this equation, but with the introduction of this factor. And this is what summarizes that the R max will decrease once the population size, which is n, reaches the carrying capacity, which is this capital K. So let's say it in a mathematical way. So let's imagine that we have, in our previous example, like 100, the carrying capacity of the population is 100 elephant, and we have only 2 elephants in the park. So here 100 minus 2, which is the population size, divided by 100. This will give you more or less like 1. So it's 98 divided by 100, more or less like 1. So you can ignore this factor, or you can imagine that this part of equation is multiplied by 1, which will give us the same equation. So here the exponential growth will happen because the population size is very far away from the carrying capacity. But let's imagine that we have now a large number of elephants that have been reproduced, and now we have something like 98 elephants. So if you subtract 98 from 100, that is 2 divided by the carrying capacity is 100. So now the exponential phase will be actually this equation will be multiplied by 0.02, and because of that, this R max is now very reduced. The increase in population size will dramatically decrease once the population size reaches the carrying capacity, as we said. Again, this is represented in figures. So the exponential growth will happen when there is no consideration for the carrying capacity. Once we put the carrying capacity, and we can see that the carrying capacity in this case is 1500, so we can see like almost like a J curve. But once we reach the 1500, once the population size reaches, as you can see here, the population size reaches the 1500, the growth rate decrease, and we get this S-shaped curve. So the logistic model takes into consideration the factors that limit the exponential growth, and they are summarized by carrying capacity. This carrying capacity of the environment may be related to availability of nutrients, or may be related to space issues. So any factor that is related to competition between the members of the same species, and this will result in an S-shaped rather than a J-shaped, which we can see in the exponential growth. So here we are showing one example that we can see in the lab for the logistic model. So if we grow a paramecium in the lab, and if the media is providing all the nutrients, and if we have no predator in the media, so the paramecium will grow exponentially. Then once the number of individuals in the population is reaching the carrying capacity of the environment, then the growth rate will decrease, giving us the S-shaped curve.